The Beaufighter was a beautiful machine. It was twin-engined, sleeve valve, made by the Bristol company, and it looked a bulky machine, but in actual fact it was a breeze to fly. Once you got to know the idiosyncrasies of it, it was magnificent. And knowing that you had 8 good rockets and 4 good cannon with you, you knew you had a worthy machine under you.
The Beaufighters, the pilots were delighted with it. It handled quite easily. Mind you, if an engine stopped, you got the gliding angle of a brick. If an engine stopped, that was your lot, problem mostly. But there was one chap on their squadron actually looped the loop in one, which was forbidden, but he did it just the same. Lots of things were done. Like, you're not supposed to smoke in board. Americans recognised the fact that people were going to smoke, and they put ashtrays, but you're not allowed to smoke in RAF aircraft, but they did.
Presenting our latest and most heavily armed fighter planes, Bristol Beaufighters. Those of you who understand such things will be interested to learn that the Beaufighters' twin engines are Bristol Hercules air-cooled sleeve valve radials, fitted with 2-speed superchargers and constant speed air screws, each developing 1,400 horsepower. Having, I hope, satisfied at least one section of my audience, I can now turn to the more easily understandable details of the RAF's 10-gun Terror of the Skies. She's specially designed for night fighting, but has already proved herself a capable day fighter. Only a week or so ago, Beaufighters made a very successful raid on aerodromes in Sicily and accounted for 30 or 40 enemy aircraft. The Beaufighter's armament consists of 4 cannon mounted in the fuselage and 6 machine guns in the wings. 10 guns, enough to blast any enemy machine out of the skies. She has a range of 1,500 miles and a speed of 330 miles per hour. The Beaufighter will go a long way to give Goering a severe pain in his Luftwaffe.
Just 2, the pilot and the navigator who did the photography, the navigation, the wireless, did the whole of the rest. About halfway down the body there's a little cupola, and the navigator sat there. He had a table in front of him, the wireless set on his right, 1 Browning gun sticking out the back here, which wasn't a great deal of use. I certainly never ever used it.
The navigator had a radio set behind him. He had his navigation table in front of him. At his feet were the ends of the cannons, and it was the navigator's job to bend down and set them to fire when you crossed the coast. And when you crossed the coast on the way home, you set them to safe again. So the pilot couldn't fire the cannons unless the navigator set them to fire. The pilot was solely responsible, of course, for dropping the bombs. He did the only navigator's job was to get him there, and then it was up to him. Later on, after a few weeks, we had G fitted to them. I don't know if you've heard of G. It was an early radar system. You had a system whereby you had a cathode ray tube, there were 2 lines on it, on which blips appeared. You had to line those blips up in a certain way, and then jiggle around with the controls. You came up with numbers, and you had to take precise time. With those numbers, you had a chart which was covered in lines going one way and in green, and lines going the other way in red. And with these figures you got from your cathode ray tube, you transfer them on, and that would give you a fix. And that was pretty accurate too, provided you took the note at the time, so that you was at that fix at that time. And forever after that, navigation was, well, I won't say it was a doddle, but it gave you a lot of confidence to know that you were on track.
As early as 1939, the desirability had been foreseen of a radar navigational aid in locating targets when we should pass to an air offensive over the continent. Experiments were conducted on a path difference system G, a possibility originally suggested in 1938 as a solution to the blind approach problem, and the first eastern chain, Stenigot, Daventry and Ventnor, was ready to operate in July 1941, in conjunction with 24 handmade airborne sets fitted to 115 Squadron. By February 1942, several hundred aircraft had been equipped.
The Beaufighter was a two-seater. The pilot sat up forward on his own, the navigator in his own seat about 12 feet behind him, I should say, with a little cupola over him. There was twin engines, and we were armed with 4 cannons. Some models, the earlier models, had machine guns in the wings, but in our aircraft, the machine guns have been taken out and replaced with long-range tanks.
So, as I say, its strength was its main characteristic. It wasn't particularly manoeuvrable, and that made our life rather difficult because, as I say, that there were various fighter drones at Norway. There were the single-engine fighters, I mean, which was a thing we didn't want to get mixed up with at all because they could outfly us terribly. They were much faster, much more manoeuvrable. In any case, our instructions were to keep away from them because we'd got 300 miles of sea to get back over if we wanted to get home. The original bows had, whilst they were still as strong, had a few problems with them, and that persisted for a long while, that they would swing very badly on takeoff. That was mainly on the earlier ones where they had Merlin engines and not the Hercules radial engines. I mean, the radial engines were very good as far as we was concerned because they are air-cooled and you could get the odd bullet through those and they would still fly and give you a certain amount of power. But the liquid-cooled engines, if you've got a spare bullet through the glycol lines or something like that, they would just pack up. Very little comfort in a Beaufighter. The best part of a bow really was that its tremendous strength. I mean, if it wasn't as strong as it had, I certainly shouldn't be here today. It was almost as safe when your undercart wouldn't work to belly land it as it was to land in the normal way. It would do damage to the aircraft, but it was tremendously strong, which was quite important on the sort of work that we were doing, because in shipping attacks you usually get a bit of damage of some sort, you know, a few bullet holes, or I know on one occasion we came back with a part of the ship's radar mast sticking out of the nose. Used to get that close to them. So, undoubtedly, I mean, the Canadians, who were a fairly rough and ready types by and large, the expression they used to use was that it was built like a brick shithouse, and that was just about right. It was tremendously strong. Well, the nature of the squadron, it was a coastal command squadron, and at that time the Beaufighters had 6 machine guns and 4 20mm cannon, and we eventually, I think we were probably one of the first squadrons to convert to use rockets, and they were, once we learnt how to aim them, a remarkably good weapon. The machine guns we used to virtually, I know we had 6 of them, but we used to virtually ignore them because they didn't do a lot of good. The cannons were very good, not only to tell you where you were going to aim your rockets, which were far, far more important than the cannon, but we got very few stoppages on cannon, very few.
Another thing which is not generally known about Beaufighters, when the pilot, if we'd done an attack on a convoy and you'd fired your cannons, your compasses were immediately up the creek. They could be up to 30 degrees inaccurate. So if you had any ammunition left, you turned on to north, as near north as you could by fire the cannons again, and that would then cancel out the error, not exactly, but very nearly, enough to get you home. And of course, every time you fired your cannons, the compasses had to be swung. When we up this G, that really did make a difference. We were happy about where you've been, and if your compass was up the creek, well, you could just make a series of fixes and follow that home.
The rocket is also a very effective anti-shipping weapon when fitted with a 25-pound head for sinking such targets as merchant ships and lightly armoured escorts, such as destroyers, flak ships, etc. Against these, the basic unit is 3 aircraft, although normally a number of such sections are used. The attack is made in a shallow 10 to 15 degree dive, and as well as armed sweeps, pre-briefed specified target strikes are flown.
It made our life a great deal easier once we got rockets. And they were a remarkably good weapon because you carried 8 of them. You could fire all 8 at once. You could fire in 2s or 4s. You could have an explosive head, an incendiary head, an armour-piercing head. And anybody that was on the receiving end of them was in for a very rough time. To learn how to aim them, we had concrete head ones, 65-pound concrete heads, and a target was set up near the shore, and we were up and down all day long, firing in pairs to find which was the easiest way to aim them. Eventually, it solved itself very quickly. What they did, they synchronised them with the cannon, and as I say, that we were always attacking ships at sea or in harbour, and when your cannon were firing, you could see the splashes in the water. If they were in the water, they were short of the ship, and the pilot brought the nose up a bit. And when you got to 600 feet, where your cannon were hitting, if you fired your rockets, they would hit in the same place. It was that simple.
The sight guns at RP are harmonized so that in the standard dive, the shell trajectory crosses the line of aim at 1,000 yards from the point of firing, whilst the RP trajectory 10 feet below the line of aim at 600 yards. If, with a sight on the target, the guns are fired at 1,000 yards, then by the time the shells reach the target, the aircraft will be 800 yards away. Thus, the method can be used for range estimation. The second advantage is that the guns can be fired at the target throughout the approach. With the sight at funnel height or above, bursts are fired at 1,500 yards. These fall below the point of aim. As the range closes, the shell strikes move nearer to the point of aim, and at the same time, this is gradually brought down to the deck line. When the point of aim and the shell strikes coincide on the deck line, the range is approximately 800 yards. By the time the pilot has noted this and put his finger to the RP button, the range will have closed to 600 yards, and the spaced salvo is now fired, giving underwater hits. At the same time, the guns are still fired. This method of harmonization is peculiar to coastal command.
See, a bullet hits the water and is stopped by the water after a few feet. Just depends what it is. A rocket, no, it's still got its propellant burning. And it'll hit the water, it will level out, and it will travel through the water until its propellant runs out. And if there happens to be a submarine there, it will go through one side of the submarine and out the other side. So that was the strategy with that. Now, torpedoes, they had to be set to the running depth before they took off. It was usually about 10 foot, I suppose, to hold the vessel in below the water line, well, as far down as possible. But that couldn't be changed once it was airborne.
The target area of a ship can be divided into 2 parts. From the superstructure to the waterline, dry hits will cause damage and have an effect on morale. but will not sink the ship. Below the waterline, an underwater hit will flood a watertight compartment, and 2 or 3 will sink the ship. The underwater trajectory of the rocket with a 25-pound solid head is very good. It varies in shape, of course, with the angle of entry, which depends on the dive angle, but the rocket is lethal up to an underwater travel of 180 feet when used against merchant vessels. This means that the target as seen by the pilot is from the waterline to a point approximately 180 feet away for an underwater hit, and from the waterline to the superstructure for a dry hit. A rocket falling along here will be lethal, and along here will damage only. Ideally, hits should be spaced at varying depths from the waterline downwards, and to get this effect, a spaced salvo is used, with the rockets entering the water at different points. This method also allows for errors on the pilot's part in range estimation. If he comes too close, he will get some dry hits and some underwater hits. If he is slightly too far away, he should get some lethal underwater hit.
When you were firing rockets, these were not explosive rockets we were using. We were using hard-nosed rockets, so that the idea was that if you hit just below the waterline, it put decent holes in the ships, which made them unserviceable, and any that went above the waterline ricocheted round inside the ship, which then upset all the communications and machinery, so that it was put out of action then for some quite considerable time if it wasn't sunk.
Now see the actual attack, but we'll watch one section of 3 only.
Hello, Senegal. Target ahead. Prepare, prepare, prepare. Hello, Senegal. Attack, attack, attack. Yes, it took perfect coordination and teamwork to produce that.
Well, by the time you got in the aircraft, had received your briefing, and got everything into position, you didn't really have time to think of anything of that nature. You simply had to make sure that the whole of the aircraft was functioning well, because after all, with those two, in our case, the two engines and the airframe, they were your friends because you were depending upon them entirely. And this is why the Beaufighter, in my view, is such a wonderful aircraft, because if you did lose an engine and you got hit so that you had to feather an engine or it got shot out, you could still possibly get home on one engine, because it provided you flew carefully and you nursed it. As long as you had sufficient fuel, you should be able to make it back to Britain. But that was one of the things that you didn't have time to think about, because there were so many other things, watching your gauges all the time, making sure that they were functioning. And there was one thing that you had to do, that was to be sure you had to certainly rely on your instruments. because when you flew through cloud, which is what you did in many respects across the North Sea, if you didn't believe your instruments, then you would have gone it, because your instruments were really the sole things that saved you. When they told you were flying straight and level, even though you felt you were diving or you were climbing, you had to believe that you were flying straight and level.
109s and Focke-Wulf 190s. And they were at Lister, we're on the southern end of Norway, at Stavanger a bit farther up, at Bardufoss in the far north. And that is why we used to do all our flying at very, very low level. Mainly to avoid radar. Because, I don't know whether you realise this, but we found, I don't know how we found, but we found that we could tell when we were being picked up by radar. If you left your intercom on, and you were flying, say, at 50 feet or even below 50 feet, if you let the aircraft rise and you left your intercom, you could hear this low-pitched buzz gradually get stronger as you rose, and that meant you were being struck by radar. And if you let the aircraft sink, you could hear it gradually die out. So we reckoned we could get, if we got really right down onto the deck, we could get to within 10 miles of Norway without being picked up by radar.
They got chased off by Messerschmitts. They had to go through the gate, as you call it. Your throttles, there's a bar, which you only went beyond that bar, excepting as a dire emergency. They went through the gate to get maximum power and got as close to the deck as they could, which makes it very difficult for a fighter to attack you if you're right on the deck, because if he dives on you, you're likely to dive into the drink himself. They got away with it, but as I say, when my first trip there, we never saw a thing.
Oh, there were so many. Nearly every big seaport, and also there were German airfields on every promontory. Or it seemed to us that there were German airfields on every promontory stacked with fighters, either Focke-Wulf 190s or ME-109s, and quite frequently one would see what looked like a team of locusts above you, and all you hoped for was that they were looking for somebody else and not for you at the time.
All your flights across the North Sea were at 50 feet, down as low as you dare get. The rougher the sea, the easier it was to fly low. The smooth and calm of the sea, the much more dodgy. You can't judge your height so well. You fly at 50 feet until you got to the area where you expected to find the trouble, then you go up to probably 300 or 400 feet possibly to get a better view, and then come in on a shallow dive.
The North Sea is the most menacing and angry place that I've ever known. It's a frightening place, the North Sea, to me. But of course, at 50 feet and below, particularly in rough weather, and we used to like to fly in rough weather because we knew there would be a certain amount of cloud cover, it is not a particularly smooth trip. You get air pockets even at 50 feet that you get at 30,000 feet, and you drop a bit, you're thrown about a bit, and we reckoned to fly at 50 feet, but often we were below it. You'd certainly get spray from the waves on your windscreen all the way in normal conditions, and on good conditions. I mean, you did get some days when the North Sea was, to use the common expression, as calm as a mill pond, and that to us was even more dangerous, because in those conditions the sea and the sky merge. It's like a light mist, and you've got no horizon. You don't really know how high you are. It's really very, very dangerous when you've got really good conditions, when you're that low. Well, one of the things that used to frighten me a great deal about, as I say, the North Sea used to frighten me, I think, probably more than anything. But one of the other things that I could never overcome the fear of was that flying at very low level, for about, the average trip was about 300 miles out, at that height you get a tremendous impression of speed. Tremendous impression of speed. And then the the pattern of all attacks are very much similar. Once you've found your target, you immediately climb to 1,500 feet. The impression it gives you then is that you've stopped. You have no impression of speed whatsoever. You feel you're hovering in the air, that any minute you're going to stall and fall out the sky. And that must have happened to me 50 times, and it still frightened me every time, because I couldn't, even if you looked at your instruments and it said you were doing 140 knots or 160, you couldn't believe it. After 300 miles at great speed, you thought you were going to fall out of the sky. That was one of the impressions I got of all that low-level flying.
Did you know before you set off what the actual targets would be? Or
Sometimes, because as well as attacking the shipping, and I did a certain amount of it, you would send one aircraft out to do a reconnaissance to see if there was a target. So sometimes you knew there was a target, sometimes you would do what you would call a rover. And a rover would be, say, from there to there, through that place, because they didn't stay out to sea, because that made them too vulnerable. They would take the protection of that very rugged coastline as much as they could. So sometimes we knew, but I would think half the time we knew that what our target was and where it was. The other half of the time we would do a rover, hoping to find something.
Of it was that the first aircraft in would strafe the target with cannon fire, the next wave come in would fire rockets, and the next wave would drop their torpedoes, because even with rocket projectiles they needed a bit steadier in target, so that's why the first aircraft took the flak, took the attention away from them, and they in turn took the attention away from the torpedo aircraft, who had to fly, as I said, a certain height, certain speed, and quite sedately, and sitting targets until they'd actually drop the torpedo. That was done in 3 waves. And then you sort of pass over the combat, come back and have another run at it on the way back, if you've got any ammunition left. That happened, we had 2 strikes which hit the headlines, because there were 22 ships in one of those convoys, which was quite something at that time.
It depended upon the importance of the shipping. If it was an important piece of shipping, they would always have flagships with them. They varied from small things with a lot of guns on them to very big things, which I think the correct expression is a spearbreaker, which is a fairly large ship which has got guns all over it. But we didn't find many of those on the Norwegian coast. We found a number of them down the French coast later on, but on the Norwegian coast they usually had small flagships which have got a lot of guns on them, and I say that there were certain sections of the flight which were detailed to deal with flagships only. They didn't attack the major target. Their job was to quieten the flagships. And exactly the same applied to them as it did to attacking the major target. That the greater saturation you could achieve, the quicker it was all over, because if you did achieve good saturation, the return flak didn't last long from them. Because, I mean, I have seen many of them jumping off the boats to get out of the way. The flak wasn't a problem if it was a good attack. If it was a good attack, the flak died down pretty quickly.
We were always in the first. We were always the first strafing aircraft. That the New Zealanders usually did the rockets, and the torpedoes come to that. I don't think our people fired any torpedoes, not while I was with them. They were just purely doing the strafing, taking the flak to take the fire from the rest coming behind us. You go back if you've got the ammunition to do it with, yes. We did that each time.
Is that more dangerous to approach, to go back over?
Well, hopefully you've silenced a few of their guns, but not necessarily. Another thing which we didn't know till afterwards, we saw flames coming up from one boat, and we thought we'd left it on fire. But the Germans were not that daft. They used to light fires on the deck. There's a nice big fire roaring away. Oh, you've hit him. We'll leave it alone. Try something else.
5 minutes before our ETA, we'll climb to our original height and sections will again take up line astern, stepped up. On sighting the target, we'll maneuver to get into position to deliver our attack on the beam. At 2,500 yards, I'll give the order to prepare, when number 3 and 4 sections will fan out into line abreast with me, number 2 remaining behind and above me. When we're about 2,000 yards away, I'll give the order for each section to deploy into open line abreast, followed by the order to attack at 1,500 yards. When I stick the nose down into the dive, my section will go in to attack the largest vessel. Sections 3 and 4 will dive at the same time to attack the other 2 ships, and Section 2 will follow in behind me, taking the signal from their own leader. After firing, keep strafing, and break away low over the deck. Keep low down over the water on the other side, and keep weaving until you're out of flak range.
The weather on the way out was appalling, but even though visibility was sometimes less than 1,000 yards in heavy rain, we managed to keep formation and make our landfall exactly on time. A few minutes before we sighted the convoy, the weather lifted, making the attack possible. The convoy, consisting of 9 ships, was only about a mile offshore and under cover of land batteries. The merchant vessels were escorted by heavily armed trawlers. I gave the order to attack, and the flakbusters climbed up to about 1,500 feet and drew ahead of the torpedo aircraft, which remained close to the water. Just before we dived to attack, the trawlers opened fire. The flak was quite heavy to begin with, but that was soon silenced. We dived down to deck level, firing as we went, and even before we pulled away, the largest merchant vessel had already been set on fire by our cannon. During our attack, the German gunners were in many cases literally blown off the ships. As a last resort, they fired off some rockets at us, but without effect. In a matter of seconds, the torpedo-carrying aircraft struck. What a sight it was! The whole convoy, which a moment before had been sailing peacefully down the coast, was now covered by a pall of smoke. Ships were on fire and sinking, and everywhere dozens of aircraft were diving, firing and turning in all directions. As I broke away, I saw the largest vessel in the convoy was a mass of flames from stem to stern. Just in front of it, there came a terrific explosion, and steam and water spouted up to 300 or 400 feet. When it subsided, the ship that had been there was there no longer. She blew up without leaving a single trace. A tanker near the head of the column was just a mass of billowing black smoke. Every single trawler was on fire. In fact, there was not a single ship in the whole convoy that was not sunk or on fire or seriously damaged. One of the largest and most successful operations ever undertaken by Coastal Command, and we didn't lose a single aircraft.
They were a hell of a long way off when we first saw them. It must have been 15 miles away, and although it was only about 3 minutes till we were onto them, it seemed an interminable time. They looked rather like a small invasion fleet, and there were actually 40 ships altogether. Only 9 of them were merchantmen, but these had 31 escort ships to look after them. They must have been expecting trouble. Our strike force immediately got ready to attack. Each crew knew exactly what is to do. I gave the signal to attack, and all of us who were flak busting dived down into the convoy, shooting at everything we got in our sights. We Aussies were in the center, with the New Zealanders on our port and the Canadians on our starboard side. The RAF squadron flew in at deck level with their tin fish. The Jerrys must have seen us at the same time we saw them, and they also knew exactly what to do, for things began to happen fast and furious. I saw 2 torpedo hits, and it wasn't very long afterward that both ships were well on their way to the bottom. One of the Aussies attacked a merchantman that must have carried barrels of oil on deck, for after a few bursts from his cannons, the oil got going and went up in a big blaze. I went in at one of the escort vessels and got in a burst at the depth charges on the deck. One of them went off with a terrific explosion that appeared to blow the stern right off the ship. In 10 minutes, a pall of black smoke covered the convoy, and practically every single one of the 40 ships was either sinking or on fire. We returned to base without losing any aircraft, though Flight Lieutenant Pilcher, as Queenslander, came in with only one good engine, after what he called an uneventful trip across the North Sea. One of our New Zealanders even brought back a souvenir. The Jerrys had been using rocket-trailing steel cables, which they fired into us, hoping the cables would foul our air screws. They didn't, but he came back with 40 feet of cable wrapped around his wing. This must have been one of the largest convoy strikes in the history of Coastal Command, and I can only say that its success was very largely due to the magnificent work of our ground crews.
The last few flights we had an American film unit flying a Boston aircraft, and they was taking photographs of any action, which was what you saw when you go on British screen when you went to the cinema. My next posting after, as I said, I wasn't an Australian, and as I was replaced by Australians, I found myself at Manson. I went to the station cinema, saw a strike on a convoy, saw an aircraft hit and go down into the sea. Afterwards I went back to the mess to see if I could scrounge a cup of tea or something. I met a chap in there. I said, I don't know you, but I know your face. You're from 489 Squadron, aren't you? He says, yes. So I said, well, I was with 455 until a couple of weeks ago. How are they doing? Oh, he said, they've had a few losses lately. I said, can you remember the names of any of them? So he said one or two names, and Costello. I said, Costello RAAF? He said, yes. I said, that was my pilot. So I'd been to the cinema and seen my own pilot shot down.